The moon had no name anymore. The Dracovine had removed it from their star charts the same way they removed everything they considered irrelevant, quietly, without ceremony, the way you erase a smudge from glass. The Orcs who had lived here for 6 generations called it Ashkelm, which in the old tongue meant something close to the place where we decided to stay. The Dracovine called it Extraction Zone 7 Theta. The girl who crouched alone in the dry ravine below the ruins of the Vorathi clan hold had stopped using any name for it at all. Names were things you gave to places you loved. She had stopped loving anything she wasn't willing to lose. Her name was Kael Vora. She was the daughter of Warchief Brak Vora, last of the old bloodline, and she had been exiled 3 cycles ago, before the silencing, before the plague, before the Dracovine crystalline ships had descended like geometric nightmares from the upper atmosphere and seeded the air with the spores that unmade nervous systems and turned the living into the quietly dead. The exile had been her father's decision, ratified by the clan elders with their carved bone rings and their averted eyes. She had been 17. She had broken the law of descent by refusing the war marriage to Sub-Chief Groktul, a man with small eyes and large appetites who smelled of stale oil and entitlement. She had said no. In the Vorathi clan, a princess did not say no. She said yes or she said nothing, and Kael Vora had always been constitutionally incapable of saying nothing. So they cast her out to the borderlands with 1 water skin, 1 knife, and the clothes on her back. 2 months later, the Dracovine came. She heard about it third hand, from a dying trader she found pinned under a collapsed granary on the outskirts of a border settlement. He told her the clan hold had been emptied. Not burned, the Dracovine didn't burn things they considered combustion wasteful. They had sealed the hold with crystal foam, floor by floor, entombing everything inside. The warchief had not gone quietly. The old man had apparently made them work for it, but he had gone. Kael Vora sat with the dying trader until his chest stopped moving. She gave him water from her skin even though she needed it herself. Then she walked north toward the clan hold ruins and stood outside the crystal-sealed walls for a long time without thinking anything particular. The emotion, when it finally arrived, was less grief than she expected, and more something she had no word for, a low, vibrating recognition, like hearing a note struck on an instrument, and knowing the instrument was broken forever. She pressed 1 palm flat against the crystal foam. It was warm. It was always warm. The Dracovine's sealing agent retained heat from the biological matter inside it for years. She did not think about that too carefully. She turned south and didn't look back. For 3 cycles she lived in the ravine system below the hold, in a network of old mining shafts and supply caches her father had built for contingency during the old border wars. The old man had been a student of paranoia long before the Dracovine made it fashionable. He'd left food, tools, water filtration equipment, 2 kinetic rifles, and a crate of his handwritten tactical notebooks. Kael Vora read them all twice. Then she read them again. She ate sparingly. She moved at night. She mapped the Dracovine patrol routes from elevated vantage points, watching the crystal-bodied soldiers move across the landscape in their precise, geometric formations, never deviating, never improvising, never looking up. They were very good at what they had planned for. They were very bad at what they hadn't. She learned to read the formations the way her father had taught her to read weather, not a single sign but the accumulation of signs, the shape of the thing in motion. A standard extraction survey unit moved in a diamond configuration, 12 soldiers arranged at precise intervals of 4 meters, the lead point doubling as sensor array, the trailing 2 functioning as data relay. They rotated the point position every 90 minutes. They took no rest breaks. They communicated entirely in the crystalline subsonic frequencies she had first detected as a faint ringing in the night air, and had gradually come to understand as a language of resonance, tonal and complex, beyond her ability to speak but not entirely beyond her ability to map. She filled 40 pages of her father's spare journals with patrol notation. She filled another 30 with frequency charts. She had no one to show this work to, which was fine. She had never done her best thinking for an audience. She had one rule, and the rule was simple: no contact. No strangers, no travelers, no survivors looking to make alliance. The borderlands attracted desperate people, and desperate people made desperate decisions, and desperate decisions got you killed, or, worse, got you captured and studied. The Dracovine were not cruel in the way that implied malice. They were cruel in the way a surgical instrument was cruel, precise, purposeful, indifferent to pain. She had seen what their study facilities looked like from a distance, and she had made her peace with the knife before she made her peace with captivity. No contact. She had been good at the rule for 3 cycles. She broke it on a Tuesday. She had no calendar, so she didn't know it was a Tuesday, but somewhere in the ruined hold there was a cracked data slate still cycling through a looping calendar display powered by residual solar charge, and it said Tuesday, and if she had known this, she might have considered it significant. Tuesday had always been her worst day. Her mother, who had died when Kael'vora was 9, from a fever the clan healers couldn't read, had always said that Tuesday was the day the universe took its second bite. She had not understood this as a child. She understood it completely now. She was checking the northern snare line, 3 kilometers from the primary cache, when she found the child. It was not a child precisely. It was a juvenile of a species she didn't immediately recognize, bipedal, roughly half her height, wrapped in the shredded remnants of what had once been a pressure suit. The species had large eyes, deeply set, pale gray in color, with pupils that were horizontal slits like a prey animal's. The skin was faintly blue-tinged, the blue of deep-sea things. The hair, what remained of it, was fine and white, and falling out in the uneven patches that Kael'vora recognized, with a cold drop in her stomach, as the beginning stages of Dracovine spore sickness. Early stage. The crystallization hadn't reached the fingertips yet. She had seen it progress before, in the border settlement survivors before the Eastern clearance. She knew how it ended. The child was unconscious. It was also, she noticed, lying in the exact center of the path she needed to walk to check the second snare. Kael'vora stood over it for a long time. No contact, she told herself. The child's chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven hitches, like a machine running low on fuel. Each exhale had a faint rasp to it, a sound like dry grass in wind. The pressure suit remnants were at least 2 sizes too large, a parent's suit probably, cut down and hemmed and still too big. Someone had loved this child carefully before losing it. She thought about her father's notebooks. There was one passage she had read so many times the page was soft with handling, the ink faded at the fold. It was from a section on battlefield triage, written in the warchief's dense, cramped hand. The decision to act is not a decision. The decision is already made by the time you are standing still and not yet moving. The standing still is just you arguing with yourself about something your hands already know. She picked up the child. It was lighter than she expected. She carried it back to the secondary cache. Not the primary, never the primary, she was not a fool, and laid it on the supply crate she used as a work table and assessed the situation with as much clinical detachment as she could manage, which was not as much as she would have liked. Spore sickness. Early stage, the hair loss was patchy, not total, and the secondary crystallization hadn't started on the fingertips yet. If she had a synthesizer and the right compounds, she could slow the progression. She didn't have a synthesizer. What she had was 3 cycles worth of her father's notes on using ground minerals and filtered plant compounds as biological countermeasures, written by a man who had anticipated needing to treat his warriors in the field without technology. Orcs were pragmatists by necessity and philosophers by character, and the combination made for excellent field medicine. Her father had been the most pragmatic person she had ever known, and she had hated him for it when she was young, and now she was deeply, savagely grateful for it in the way you are grateful for things only after they have saved your life. She made the compound. It took 6 hours and all of her remaining blue moss and half a water filtration membrane that she would need to replace within 2 weeks. She administered it by soaking a strip of cloth and laying it across the child's throat where the lymphatic clusters were densest in most oxygen-breathing species. She had learned this from her father's xenobiology notes, written during the old border negotiations when the clans had traded with a dozen different peoples. Then she sat in the dark and watched the child breathe and didn't sleep and felt very, very alone in the way you can only feel alone when you are alone by choice and suddenly responsible for something that did not choose you back. The child woke at dawn. It looked at her with those horizontal pupil eyes and made no sound. No scream, no cry, no word. It simply looked at her the way someone looks at a thing they are still deciding whether to be afraid of. Kael'Vora didn't move. She kept her hands visible on her knees, which was a gesture she had learned meant non-aggression across most species she'd encountered in the border markets before the silencing. The child looked at her hands. Then it looked at her face. Then, after a long time, it reached out one small hand and touched the back of her wrist, very lightly, the way you touch something to see if it's real. She let it. She called it Sara, because she had to call it something, and Sara was the name her mother had given to the small ceramic figurine that had sat on the windowsill of their quarters, a little painted thing with large eyes that watched the room and seemed to pay close attention to everything. The child seemed unbothered by the name. The child seemed unbothered by most things in a way that was either very wise or the result of having been through enough that the ordinary had stopped registering as remarkable. It communicated in a limited, precise vocabulary of touch and sound. A tap on the wrist meant yes, 2 taps meant no. A particular low hum, throaty and sustained, meant fear. A different pitch of hum, lighter and more musical, meant something close to contentment. It could not or would not speak in any language Kael'Vora had heard, which she had come to suspect was a choice rather than a limitation. For 3 weeks this was their arrangement. Kael'Vora kept the child alive, and the child kept her company, and neither of them asked the other for anything more than this. She maintained the no-contact rule for everything beyond the 2 of them. She moved her patrol routes. She doubled the perimeter checks. She slept in shifts and kept a rifle within reach at all times and thought with increasing frequency about what she would do if the Dracovine came before she had time to move. She was not happy. Happiness felt like a word from another life, a word that belonged to people who had not stood outside crystal-sealed walls and listened to the silence of everything they had lost. But she was not entirely alone, and she had forgotten until now how much of survival was about having something to check on, something that needed you to come back. The snares were the same, the patrols were the same, the compounds were the same. But coming back had a different weight to it now, and the weight was not unpleasant. Sara's spore sickness slowed, the hair loss halted, the color improved. One morning Kael'Vora watched the child sit in a shaft of pale morning light that came through the ventilation crack in the mining shaft ceiling, face tilted up toward the warmth, eyes closed, utterly still. She thought the word content and decided it was close enough to true. And then the man arrived, and everything she had built fell apart. He came from the east, from the direction of the old trade road, moving in the open like someone who had either stopped caring about the Dracovine patrols or had never understood them to begin with. She spotted him from the high ridge 2 kilometers out and watched him for an hour before he found the outer edge of the ravine. He was Orc, which was unexpected. She had not seen another Orc in over a cycle. He was tall, lean in the way you get lean when you've been walking too long on too little, with the kind of face that was probably good-looking before it got tired, and was still probably good-looking if you were inclined to look past the exhaustion. He moved with a careful deliberateness that read as someone who had learned to be cautious the hard way, which was the only way to learn it. When he found the edge of the ravine and stopped and looked down into it, she had the rifle on him before he finished turning. "Don't," she said. He raised his hands, slowly, the gesture of someone who had done this before. "I'm not armed," he said. "You're lying." A pause. I have a knife. Everyone has a knife. I mean, you're not only armed with a knife. Another pause. Then from behind his lower back, he produced a short-barreled plasma pistol and set it carefully on the stone in front of him. She watched him do it without moving the rifle. That's everything, he said. It isn't, she said, but I appreciate the effort. What do you want? He was a salvager, he said. His name was Tan. He had been working the eastern ruins for residual tech before the Dracovine patrols compressed their perimeter and cut off his extraction route 3 days ago. He needed water and a place to shelter for 1 night, maybe 2, while he found a new route south. He spoke well. He had an ease to his words that had the grain of someone who had talked his way out of things before and found it worked often enough to keep trying. He was not the kind of person she trusted. He was also not the kind of person she could send away without consequence. His eyes had gone to the entrance to the secondary cache, and she realized, with a cold clarity, that he had seen more than she had intended him to see, and that if she sent him away he would carry that information with him and she could not control where it went. She lowered the rifle, mostly. "1 night," she said. "You don't go past the secondary cache. You don't touch the supply stores without asking. You sleep in the outer chamber and you stay there." "Understood. And if you do anything that suggests you're in contact with anyone, Dracovine, other survivors, anyone, I won't ask questions first." He looked at the rifle, then at her. "Understood," he said again, in a slightly different tone, the tone of someone who had just recalibrated their estimate of the situation. She led him down. He met Sara and went very still in the particular way adults go still when they encounter a child they didn't know existed. Something moved in his face that she didn't analyze too closely because she didn't want to feel sympathetic toward him. He looked at Sara's recovering hairline, the fine white fuzz coming back in patches, and the compound-soaked cloth still wrapped around the small wrist. He looked at Kael'Vora. He said, very quietly, "How long have you had the spore sickness treatment?" "I don't," she said. "I developed a field compound. It's temporary and resource-intensive and requires resupply every 4 days." He was quiet for a moment. "You developed it?" "My father's notes. He was a war chief." Brak-Vora, he looked at her differently now, not with the wariness he'd come down with, but with something older, more considered. "I heard of him. Everyone in the eastern sector heard of him. He held the Kareth Eastern Pass for 9 days after the silencing started, without support, without resupply, with—" He stopped. "I'm sorry for your loss." "He wasn't lost," she said. "He was entombed. There's a distinction." She moved past him toward the supply stores. "The rule about the outer chamber stands." He stayed 1 night. He was useful, which was the thing she found most difficult to dismiss. He knew the Eastern Patrol routes in detail she didn't have, and they traded information in the spare, transactional way of people who both know the value of it and have no interest in wasting either their own or the other person's time. He ate less than she expected and didn't complain about what there was. He watched her work, the compound preparation for Sara, the evening patrol notation, the frequency charts, with an attention she was aware of but chose not to comment on. He told her the salvager networks had been broken up by the Dracovine compression 3 months ago, that most of the independent survivors in the eastern sector had been cleared out or had moved south ahead of the extraction front, that the Dracovine were preparing the next phase, a mineral pulse operation that would liquefy the bedrock across a 200-kilometer radius, releasing the mineral substrate the Dracovine's ships ran on. She had read enough of their survey markers to understand the technology in outline. She had not let herself think through the full implication until now. "They'll sterilize the surface," he said. "Everything living in the affected zone. They've done it on 3 other moons in this system. It takes about 4 days. After that, there's nothing left but bedrock and the extraction machinery." She had known this was coming. She had read the pattern in the patrol movements for months, the survey density increasing, the unit frequency concentrating around the central mineral veins. Knowing it and hearing it said out loud were different experiences. Knowing a thing kept it at a certain useful distance. Hearing it collapsed that distance entirely. Timeline, she said. 40 cycles, maybe less. The compression front is moving faster than their initial survey predicted. She thought about her father's tactical notebooks. She thought about what she had mapped of the patrol routes. She thought about the mineral vein running under the ravine system, which the Dracovine had already surveyed. She had found their survey markers 6 weeks ago, little crystalline spikes driven into the stone floor, and which sat directly in the probable center of the pulse zone. "You need to move," he said, "both of you, south through the Karath lowlands. There's a passage under the old 9th bridge that the Dracovine haven't mapped yet. I know it. I've been using it. I can take you through." She studied him. He had an open face, and open faces were either genuinely open or they were the most dangerous kind. She had no way to tell which this was. She was tired of not being able to tell which it was. "Tomorrow morning," she said. "We leave tomorrow." He smiled. It was a good smile, not the performance of a smile but something that reached his eyes, and she found that harder to dismiss than she would have liked. She filed that information away under things to be cautious about. That night she didn't sleep well. Sora slept curled in the corner of the secondary cache, making the small, contented humming sound, and the sound was close enough to the sound her mother used to make when she thought no one was listening. A low, absent-minded music that meant the world was, for the moment, sufficient, that Kael'Vora had to lie very still for a while and breathe carefully until the similarity stopped mattering. She thought about her father, not the entombing, not the end, the man. The way he had stood in the training yard in the early mornings, running her through the forms with a wooden practice blade, patient in a way he was not patient with anyone else. He would correct her grip without explaining why until she had practiced the correction 50 times. Then he would explain why. She had always resented this method. She had understood too late that it was deliberate, that he was teaching her to trust the form before she understood the reason, because in the moments when you needed the form most, you would not have time for reasons. The blade follows the body follows the intention. The intention is the only thing that matters. Everything else is just the form it takes. She had been 12. She had not yet been told that she would be married to Grok Tull by her 20th year. She had not yet understood that the patience he was showing her had an expiration date built into it, that he was teaching her to be a warrior with one hand and arranging her as a political currency with the other, and that these two projects were, in his mind, entirely compatible. She thought she hadn't cried in 3 cycles. She found out she was wrong. The crying was brief and she didn't permit it to be loud. She lay in the dark and listened to the Dracovine extraction machinery 20 kilometers north, that constant low percussion like a heart the size of a mountain, and she let herself grieve, which is the same thing as saying she let herself feel the full weight of the thing she had been carrying without putting it down, just for a moment, just so her arms knew the weight exactly. In the morning she was herself again, which was to say she was efficient and watchful, and kept the grief packed small enough to carry without slowing down, which was the only grief that was useful. They broke camp in silence. Sora helped or performed helping, which in a child is mostly the same thing, the performance of usefulness being its own kind of contribution, rolling the supply cloth with careful, serious concentration, humming quietly at the contentment frequency. Tan carried the heavier caches without being asked and didn't make a performance of doing it. Kael'Vora took the rifle and the tactical notebooks and the water filtration equipment and left everything else. You left what you couldn't carry. Her father had written that too, in the section on expeditionary withdrawal. The army that cannot abandon its baggage has already lost. The warrior who cannot abandon a possession has already been captured by it. She had thought about that line more times than she could count when she was standing outside the crystal-sealed walls, both hands and no hands, empty. They moved south through the morning, threading the ravine system at a pace calibrated to Sora's short legs and the loaded packs. The moon's sun was pale and distant, the light it cast clean and cold, the shadows long and precise. The vegetation was sparse. Low, tough-fibered ground creepers and the occasional stand of mineral-stalk trees, their trunks shot through with the metallic veining that made Ashkelm worth extracting to the Dracovine. She had always thought the veined trunks were beautiful, had thought this since she was a child walking this same territory with her father on inspection rounds, the mineral threads catching the morning light and making the trees look like something that had been forged rather than grown. She had not told anyone this. It was not information that served any tactical purpose, and in the years since her exile she had become strict about the difference between information that served a tactical purpose and information that served no purpose other than to make you feel the loss more specifically when the thing was gone. She had not spent enough time with people. She knew this. She had a habit of cataloging her own interior states the way you catalog supplies, noting what you have, what's running low, what's been used up, without doing anything about the inventory. Tan's presence was forcing the catalog to update in ways she was not entirely ready for. He walked beside her for the first hour in silence, which she appreciated. He seemed to understand without being told that she was not a person who liked to fill silence with sound for its own sake. Around midday he said, quietly, "The 9th bridge passage is about 6 hours south at this pace. If the patrols are on the 2-day cycle I mapped last month, we have a window starting in about 4 hours. They shifted to a 40-hour cycle 8 weeks ago," she said. He looked at her. "How do you know that?" "I mapped them for 3 cycles." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Your father would have liked you," he said. She didn't answer. The compliment landed somewhere deep and complicated, and she didn't have time to unpack it, so she packed it away with the grief and kept walking. In the early afternoon, they stopped on a shelf of stone above a dry riverbed, wide, flat-bottomed, channeled by the ancient water that no longer came. Sora's treatment was due. Kael'vora prepared it from the traveling kit she'd assembled, working from muscle memory, her hands moving through the sequence without requiring conscious direction. Tan sat 10 meters away and ate sparingly from his own stores and watched the landscape. Sora sat very still through the treatment with that quality she had decided to call dignity. A child-sized stillness that was not passive but attentive, the way a person sits still when they understand the reason for the stillness. When she looked up from the work, Tan was watching her. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "You're good at that." "I have had a lot of practice." He looked away. Something moved in his posture, a slight tightening across the shoulders, a change in how his weight was distributed, subtle enough that she almost didn't notice. Almost. She noticed. She said nothing. She filed it. She kept her hands moving through the completion of the treatment, cleaning the residue from the application cloth, resealing the compound canister, replacing the travel kit in the pack. She was precise and unhurried and paid attention to everything she was appearing not to notice. An hour later, when Tan stood and said he needed to check the northern approach before they moved on, she watched the direction he walked instead of the direction he had indicated. They were not the same direction. The discrepancy was small, 30 degrees, 40 at most, the kind of thing that could be navigation error in unfamiliar terrain. It was inconsistent with the precision he had demonstrated all day. It was inconsistent with the exactness of his route knowledge. It was the kind of inconsistency that had a reason. She did not call out. She sat with Sora and waited and thought very carefully and quickly through the possibilities. There were 3. He was mistaken about the direction, which was possible but inconsistent with his demonstrated accuracy. He had seen or heard something he didn't want to share, which was possible but would have been better served by telling her directly. Or he was doing something he didn't want her to observe, which was consistent with the shoulder tension she had noted and consistent with the slight change in his breathing she had registered during the treatment and consistent with guilt. Guilt was consistent with betrayal. She had the rifle and she had Sara and she had one choice, and the choice was the same choice her father had always tried to get her to understand, was the only choice worth understanding. Act before you know everything, because knowing everything is a condition that never arrives. She picked up Sara. She moved east, into the rockfall that climbed the eastern wall of the shelf, away from the path and away from Tan's position, moving low and quiet, the way she had learned to move in the long nights of the first cycle when the Dracovine patrols had been thickest and every shadow could be a soldier. She had been moving for 4 minutes when she heard the tone. It was a high, clean, crystalline frequency, the Dracovine long-range communication resonance, something between a signal and a song, a sound that was entirely alien and entirely intentional, carrying in its overtones a specificity that she had learned to read the way her father read weather signs. She had heard it before, from the distance of the high ridge. She had never heard it this close. It was coming from the direction Tan had walked. A contact beacon, a location tag. I have found the target, please confirm and approach. She put Sara down behind the largest piece of rockfall, pressed the child's small shoulder gently but firmly to indicate stay, put her finger to her lips, a gesture they had established weeks ago, the same gesture across most species she had ever encountered because it was the logical gesture for silence, and moved back toward the sound with the rifle up and her breathing controlled, and her mind in the blank deliberate space her father had called the clarity before the form. She found Tan 30 meters from where he had claimed to be going, crouched in a shallow depression in the rock, a small crystalline emitter in both hands, the signal tone still carrying from it in clean, ringing waves. He was looking northwest toward the approach line. He heard her when she was 2 meters away and started to turn. She put the muzzle of the rifle against the base of his skull. He went completely still. The emitter continued its tone. "Set it down," she said. He set it on the stone. The tone continued for 3 more seconds and then, as the signal completed its compressed transmission cycle, stopped. "How long?" she said. He didn't answer immediately. "How long?" she said, and her voice was very flat, the flatness of something that has been compressed past the point of further compression. "Have you been working for them?" A slow breath. 6 months. They have my son. He was taken in the eastern clearance he was salvaging with me when the unit came through. They offered terms. If I brought them location tags on significant survivor caches on anyone with technical capabilities, they would. He stopped. They said they would reclassify him as a research collaborator, that he would survive the extraction. "You believe that?" "I believe." His voice cracked. He recovered it. "I believe I had no other choice." "You had at least one other," she said. "You're standing in the consequence of it." She held the rifle very still. She was thinking about the passage she had not read as many times as the others because it was the passage she found hardest to sit with. It was from a section on captives and betrayal, written in the field hand, in a hurry. The man who betrays you for love is still a man. The man who betrays you for power is still a man. The tribe does not survive by pretending otherwise, but it also does not survive by forgetting that there are things which make men break that you would also have broken for, if the thing they loved had been placed in the same scale. She stood behind Tan for a long moment. Then she reached down and picked up the emitter and put it in her pack. "Get up," she said. "You are going to tell me the exact patrol formation, the approach vector, the unit composition, and the command structure of the detail that's coming. Every detail you know. And then you are going to help me address them before they reach this position. And if you run, deviate, hesitate, or do anything I have not specifically instructed, I will not shoot you. I will leave you in their path. You understand what reclassification actually means in their processing chain better than I do." He turned, very carefully, and looked at her over the muzzle of the rifle. His face was the face of someone who had just been given back something they thought was gone forever, and was not yet sure it was real. "Why are you staying?" he said. "You could make the bridge by nightfall if you moved now." "Without me, why are you not running?" "Because this is my moon," she said. "Get up." She had 40 minutes. Her father had written about what 40 minutes felt like in a real operational context. It was never enough, and it was always exactly as much as there was. Plans existed to be revised by terrain and reality. The function of a plan was not to survive contact with the enemy, but to give the mind a structure to revise from. She moved fast, and she moved with precision. She sent Tan back to Sora's position with explicit instructions: guard the child, stay under the overhang, do not move, do not make any sound. She took the emitter and the rifle, and she climbed the rockfall to the eastern shoulder above the dry riverbed. The climb was 9 minutes and left blood on both palms from the mineral stalk thorns, which she noticed and set aside. From the shoulder she could see the approach vector Tan had described. The long flat expanse to the northwest, open ground where the Dracovine patrol formations preferred to operate. She could already see 3 crystalline shapes on the horizon, moving in their characteristic configuration with that particular geometric precision. She had spent 3 cycles watching from the high ridge, a diamond forward unit and 2 flanking subunits of 6. 24 soldiers total. Standard extraction survey escort, not a combat unit, a clearance unit. They were moving toward a location tag, expecting a compliant processing target. They were not expecting adaptation. The Dracovine did not expect adaptation from prey species. This was their operational axiom. It was, in her studied assessment, their fundamental and fatal error. She had 31 minutes when she began setting the charge. The charge was not in her father's notebooks. The charge was something she had built over 2 months from components she had retrieved from a Dracovine sensor post that had malfunctioned and been abandoned in the northern sector. She had approached the abandoned post with extreme caution and spent 4 days studying it before touching anything, reading the components through her father's notes on crystal resonance mechanics from the Borderera technical exchanges. She had understood, eventually, that the crystalline resonance emitters the Dracovine used for mineral survey pulsing were not designed to distinguish between mineral vibration frequencies and biological vibration frequencies when they cycled into overload. The distinction simply had not been factored into the design. This was because the Dracovine had not modeled a scenario in which their own survey equipment would be directed against their own biology. They were very logical. They planned for what they had conceived. They did not plan for what they had not conceived, because what they had not conceived, by definition, was not a planning factor. She buried the modified emitter in the center of the dry riverbed, below the thin mineral crust of the drainage shelf, angled to project upward at the angle that would maximize diffusion across the shelf's width. She buried it in 11 minutes, which left room in the timeline. She covered the disturbance with loose dust and dry creeper stems, and backed up the eastern bank, and settled into position behind a boulder with the trigger wire fed down through a natural crack to where her right hand rested on the detonation toggle. 22 minutes. She lay on her stomach on the rock and breathed at 4 counts in, 4 counts out, and thought about the approach vector and the distance to the emitter position, and the 12 meters of trigger wire between her hand and the thing she had built. The sun was a pale smear. The dust had a mineral taste to it that she had stopped noticing and now noticed again, specifically, the way you notice specific things in the time before certainty ends. She thought about Sora in the rockfall 100 meters back, small and specific and alive, and currently the primary reason she was doing this instead of running. She thought about her father. She thought about the training yard and the wooden practice blade, and the way the morning light came through the yard gate at a low angle and made long shadows of the forms. She thought about her mother's figurine on the windowsill, large eyes watching the room. She thought about nothing at all, which was the same thing. The nothing was not emptiness. The nothing was the form waiting for the intention. The Drasavine came. They moved the way she had always known them to move, precise intervals, the diamond steady and exact, their crystalline carapaces catching the pale sun and throwing tiny fractured prisms of light across the dust. She watched the forward unit enter the dry riverbed from the northwest, the lead point soldier sweeping sensor arcs left and right, following the open channel down the route their survey data indicated. The drainage shelf was broad and flat and offered easy passage. They took it. 8 of the 12 forward unit were over the shelf when she triggered the emitter. The resonance pulse was directional and calibrated. She had calibrated it to the Drasavine biological frequency, because she had spent 3 cycles observing their communication resonance, and had understood that any species that used crystalline resonance for internal neurology was using the same crystalline matrix in their bodies that they used in their technology, and a disruption frequency that overloaded one would overload the other. She had not been able to test this. She had only been able to reason through it to its conclusion and trust her father's principle, which she had read 47 times at minimum. The enemy's strength and the enemy's weakness are the same thing. You find one, you have found both. The 8 units in the primary formation came apart. It was not an explosion. It was not a fire or a concussive event. It was a dissolution, the crystalline matrices in their bodies losing coherence simultaneously, a total and instantaneous failure of the Drasavine equivalent of a central nervous system. They fell, and in falling they made a sound she would hear in her quiet moments for the rest of her life. A sustained, descending, crystalline chord, as if someone had dropped the world's most complex instrument from a very great height and heard it come to pieces in the air before it reached the ground. The flanking subunits broke formation. Broke was the wrong word. They executed a retreating formation, which was what the Drasavine did under unexpected contact, because they had protocols for tactical retreat and no protocols for the thing they had just experienced. She was already moving. She came off the eastern shoulder and down the bank and into the riverbed on the far side, keeping below the retreating unit's sight lines, moving fast and flat and not looking at what she was moving past, because looking served no purpose and had a cost she wasn't prepared to pay right now. She had 11 minutes before the response signal would reach regional command. She used them precisely. She used the captured emitter, Tan's contact beacon, and she used 3 cycles of mapped patrol frequencies, and she used 30 pages of her father's notes on communication disruption written for the old border war technology, but built on the same underlying principle, which was not a principle of technology at all but a principle of epistemology. You do not fight the enemy's communication. You become it. You become it so completely and so briefly that by the time they understand you are not what they thought you were, you are already somewhere else. She sent the all-clear signal on the survey escort's frequency. She calibrated the crystal signature to the escort unit's last logged biological identifier, which she had captured during their approach. She had 11 minutes to reach the 9th bridge passage. She had no certainty the false signal would hold for 11 minutes. She had every reason to believe it would not. It held for 19. 19 minutes was enough to reach the passage entrance, enough to be below the rock shelf, and into the first chamber before the Drasavine Regional Command's confirmation request arrived on a frequency she could no longer answer without a living crystalline unit to provide the biological response. By the time the false signal collapsed and the Drasavine data analysis understood what they were looking at, she was 2 kilometers underground with a child on her back and a salvager with a guilty conscience lighting the way with a work lamp. Tan didn't speak for most of the passage. The tunnel was narrow and low in places, and the work lamp threw long shadows that swayed with each step. Sara rode on Kael'Vora's back and hummed, quietly, the contentment frequency. The sound echoed strangely in the stone. When Tan finally spoke, he said, "I didn't know about the child." It wouldn't have changed what you did, she said. You have a child of your own. He stopped. How did you know? You went completely still when you saw Sara, the way a parent goes still, not the way a stranger does. He was quiet for a moment. I didn't know you could read. I spent 3 cycles alone watching things, she said. You learn to read what people don't say. It's mostly what matters. He was quiet again for a long time. Then he said, what do you want me to do now, after this? She thought about it. There are other survivors south of the Kareth lowlands. You said so. I need to know who they are, and what they know, and whether any of them have technical capability I don't. You're planning something. I'm planning to be difficult to extract, she said. I have 39 cycles. The Dracovine designed their mineral pulse to operate in an environment without adaptive resistance. I intend to make the environment adaptive. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, alone. Not anymore, she said. They came up on the southern side of the 9th bridge after 4 hours in the passage, the tunnel opening onto a slope of loose stone and then a wide, shallow lowland where the sky was different, wider, higher, the horizon unbroken by the ravine walls she had lived between for 3 cycles. The vegetation was thicker, greener in the blue-gray way of plants that had access to actual water. There were root trees with broad canopies, their leaves turning in a light wind, the mineral veining in their bark less dense here, further from the extraction zone. The air had a different temperature and a different smell, something alive in it beyond mere chemical composition, the smell of an ecosystem that had not yet been surveyed into its component minerals. Sora looked up at the sky. The sound the child made was one Kael'Vora had not heard before, not the fear hum and not the contentment hum, and not any frequency in the vocabulary they had established between them. It was something else, something that had no precedent in their communication, a clear, ascending tone like a question asked by something that had not previously known there were questions. She decided, after considering it for a moment, that it was wonder. She decided after another moment that wonder was a reasonable response. She set Sora down and let the child walk on its own legs. They were still short legs, but they were steadier than they had been. She stood in the lowland light and thought about what came next, which was something she had not let herself think about in 3 cycles, because next required a version of the future that she had not been able to afford to hold on to. 40 cycles before the mineral pulse. 40 cycles to map the southern lowland, to learn the patrol patterns here, to find the survivors Tan knew about and assess them, and decide what was possible. 40 cycles to read her father's notebooks once more with the specific purpose of understanding them, not as a memorial to a man she had loved and lost, but as a military resource created for exactly this situation, written by someone who had understood that the worst always arrived, and the question was what you had prepared to meet it with. She had the rifle and the field kit and the tactical notebooks, and the emitter and her father's voice in the back of her mind, patient and cramped and precise, telling her things he had never quite said to her face, because they were not the kind of things the war chief said to his heir in the training yard under the eyes of the clan elders. She had Sara, which was not the same as family but was something she had no better word for, something that had changed the weight of coming back. She had Tan, which was not the same as alliance but was the beginning of the material from which alliance could be made, if she was careful and he was honest, and they were both lucky enough to have time to find out. She had the thing she had always had, the thing the clan elders had tried to treat as a character defect, the thing Grok Tull had tried to domesticate, the thing the Dracovine could not conceptualize because they had no category for it in their vast and systematic and ultimately finite understanding of living organisms. She had the capacity to refuse. To look at the logical outcome, the certain outcome, the mathematically overwhelming outcome, and say no and mean something entirely other than the logical alternative. Not surrender, not denial. Something harder and quieter and more specific. The decision to make the future different from what the present predicted, not because she had the resources to guarantee it, but because she was the kind of person who had never been able to stop trying. She had stood outside the crystal-sealed walls of the Vorathi clan hold and felt the full weight of everything she had been born to and cast out from and lost, and she had turned around. She would keep turning around. That was the principle. That was the tribe. The Drasavine were very good at planning. They were very good at resource assessment, probability modeling, systematic processing, environmental reduction. They were very good at almost everything they turned their attention to, and they turned their attention methodically to everything that fit within the parameters of what they had already conceived. They had not turned their attention to her. They had logged her probably as a single low-risk organic presence, a residual survivor in a cleared zone, something to be processed in the final sweep before extraction. She intended to give them 39 cycles to keep that conclusion in their data. She moved south into the lowland with her strange and particular collection of broken and surviving things, in the flat silver light of a moon with no official name, under a sky that was still and enormous and waiting in the way that places wait when something is about to be decided in them. Behind her, 20 kilometers north, the Drasavine crystalline survey ships were recalibrating their instruments over the anomaly zone, processing a result their models described as aberrant. Their data showed a biological signature that had disappeared from tracking after disrupting a standard clearance formation in a manner consistent with engineered countermeasures. Their probability models assigned a value of 0.003 to the scenario of a single organic entity, accomplishing this without support infrastructure. They reclassified it, residual statistical variance, a data artifact in a compromised sensor environment. They moved the instrument south and recalibrated and closed the file. This was the mistake. Not the tactical mistake. Tactical mistakes could be recovered from, could be incorporated into the next model iteration. This was the deeper error, the one that lived at the center of their operational philosophy, the assumption that what they had not conceived was not conceivable, the assumption that a species already categorized as prey could not revise its own category, the assumption that what had been defeated before could not learn, that what had been scattered could not cohere, that what had been exiled and grieving and alone in a dry ravine with a notebook full of dead handwriting, and a child who hummed in the dark, was simply a data point in a clearance record. Her father had written, in the last entry of the last tactical notebook, in the fast and pressing field hand that meant he was writing in poor light with time running short. The tribe is not the people standing around you. The tribe is the principle you are willing to carry alone. Everything else is just finding the ones who are willing to carry it with you. She had been 17 when she refused Groktal. She had been 17 when they put her out with a knife and a water skin and their backs turned. She had been carrying it since then, through the exile, through the silencing, through 3 cycles of a ravine that smelled of mineral dust and the distant percussion of machines that wanted to turn everything she was born to into raw material. She had been carrying it alone, and then not entirely alone, and now, in the wide lowland light, with the weight of the pack on her back and Sora's Wonderhum floating up into the air around them, and Tan walking 3 paces behind with the work lamp still in his hand, even though it was day, because old habits in dangerous places die only when there is time to let them. She was still carrying it. Not yet finished, not yet done. Sora hummed the wonder frequency, the new one, the one without precedent. Kael'Vora listened to it, and kept moving and thought about 39 cycles, and what you could build in 39 cycles, with the right understanding of how crystalline resonance met crystalline biology. And the thought had the quality of something that was not yet a plan, but was the ground a plan would grow from. The moon had no name anymore. She was working on that. She had named the child Sora, but she had never named herself. Not since the exile. The clan had stripped her of the Vorathi suffix. She was no longer Kael'Vora of the Vorathi bloodline. the elders had declared formally in the courtyard with the bone rings raised. She was simply Kale, a sound with no clan attached to it. She had used the exile name for 3 cycles because you used what you had. But walking south through the lowland, she found herself thinking, for the first time, that the name they had stripped from her had been their name, not hers. The name she carried was not the suffix. It was the principle. The thing her father had tried to give her, incompletely, imperfectly, with the same hands that had also arranged her like a treaty clause, was the same thing the elders thought they had taken away. They had only taken the word for it. She stopped walking. Tan nearly walked into her. He pulled up short and looked at her. Sara, whose hand was in hers, stopped and looked up. "What?" Tan said. She was quiet for a moment. The lowland wind moved through the root trees. The broad leaves turned, silver pale on their undersides. "Nothing," she said. "Keep moving." But she had decided something, and the decision had no words attached to it and did not need them. It sat in the same place as the form her father had taught her, below the level of the language, in the body, in the intention. The blade follows the body. The body follows the intention. The intention is the only thing that matters. They made camp 2 hours later in a root tree stand above a shallow creek that ran clean and cold through a limestone bed. The water was real, untouched by the Dracovine Mineral Survey, too small, too peripheral, too shallow to register as a resource deposit. She filtered it anyway from habit and used the surplus to replenish the treatment compound stores and fill every container they had. Tan set a small perimeter using techniques she recognized as similar to her own and different in the particulars. The way 2 people trained in the same discipline by different teachers will produce work that is recognizably related and distinctly individual. "Where did you learn perimeter technique?" she asked. "My uncle," he said, driving the last survey stake. "He ran border security for the Eastern Trading Collective before the silencing. He was killed in the first clearance wave." "He did good work," she said. He looked at her. Something in his face moved, the way emotion moves in people who have been carrying things alone for long enough that an acknowledgement arrives like an unexpected weight shifted off a shoulder. "Thank you," he said. They ate in silence. Sara ate very small amounts with great seriousness, as if each bite were a considered decision. Kael'Vora watched the child eat and thought about the juvenile pressure suit, 2 sizes too large, carefully hemmed, a parent's suit reworked for a child. She thought about whoever had done that hemming. She thought about the Eastern clearance. She thought about Tan's son, whose name she had not asked and probably should. "His name," she said. Tan looked up. "What?" "Your son, what is his name?" He was quiet for a moment. "Daret." She nodded. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. She let the name sit in the space between them with the weight it deserved, which was the weight of a reason to keep going. Not a promise. She didn't make promises about things she couldn't control, but a reason, a name on the list of things she was working toward. The Dracovine had a son of his in a reclassification facility somewhere in the processing chain. They had sealed her father in crystal foam. They had seeded the air with spores that had killed most of what she had ever known. They had taken a moon, 6 generations of her people had decided to stay on, and called it Extraction Zone 7 Theta, and begun the slow process of reducing it to its component minerals. She had 39 cycles. She had a rifle and a field kit and 47 pages of patrol notation, and 3 cycles of frequency charts. She had a modified resonance emitter and a captured contact beacon, and a solid working knowledge of how crystalline biology responded to calibrated disruption. She had a father's notebooks written for a war fought with different tools against different enemies that were ultimately the same kind of enemy, the kind that did not believe you were a factor until you were the only factor that remained. She had Tan's knowledge of the Southern survivor networks and his technical salvage expertise and his deeply personal motivation, which was the most reliable kind. She had Sara, who was getting stronger every day and who communicated in a vocabulary of sound and touch that she was slowly learning to extend, and who had introduced a frequency into her life, the wonder frequency, the new one that she had not had before and did not intend to stop hearing. She had most essentially the Drasavine's certainty that she was a data artifact, a residual statistical variance, a rounding error in their extraction model. She intended to remain a rounding error for exactly as long as it served her purpose. Across the creek, in the root tree shadows, a small animal moved through the undergrowth, something she hadn't seen in the northern ravine system, something that belonged to this less extracted place. It was roughly the size of her fist, dark-furred with the quick, precise movements of something that had survived by being fast and small and invisible. It stopped at the creek edge and drank. It looked up once, directly at her, with eyes that caught the low evening light and held it briefly. Sora made a sound beside her, the wonder frequency. "Yes," Kelvora said, "I see it." The small animal finished drinking and vanished back into the undergrowth, leaving the creek to its own sound. She let out a breath she hadn't been aware of holding. Above the root tree canopy, the first stars were appearing in the lower dark of the sky, the pale scattered light of the system's outer belt coming through the thinning atmosphere of the late cycle evening. She knew those stars. She had learned them as a child from her father during the night inspection rounds, had learned their names in the old tongue, and the practical names the traders used, and the Drasavine survey designations she had cataloged from the transit signals she'd intercepted. 3 different vocabularies for the same light, which was something she found, in the deepest and quietest part of herself, beautiful. She would not say this out loud. She was still in many ways her father's daughter. But she looked at the stars, and she let herself look. Tomorrow she would begin mapping the Southern Patrol patterns. Tomorrow she would have Tan describe every survivor contact he had made in the past 6 months, every technical capability, every resource. Tomorrow she would start building the next version of the plan, the Southern version, the version that had room in it for 39 cycles and a child who hummed in wonder and a salvager who had betrayed her for love and was now, she thought, probably trustworthy for the same reason. Tonight the creek ran clean and the stars came out and Sora was warm beside her and alive, and the moon had no name, and that was a problem she was going to solve. One way or another. She was very good at solving problems no one had thought to plan for. The Drasavine would learn this. They would learn it the only way anything learned anything in her father's estimation. Too late, from a direction they hadn't mapped, at a cost they hadn't modeled. She smiled, which was something she had not done in a long time, and it felt like a form remembered from practice. The blade follows the body follows the intention. The intention, for the first time in 3 cycles, had a direction other than survive. The intention was to win.